Over the past couple of weeks, we've been learning a lot about Steve Bannon and his worldview, thanks to, of course, his position in the Trump administration. Now, not too long ago, there were stories that were going around, one of them in the Huffington Post, about how Steve Bannon had been referencing the refugee crisis from Syria. As you know, there's been a civil war there for the last 60 years. Been a lot of refugees coming in, not only to America, but mostly to Europe and other surrounding countries and surrounding areas. And Bannon, of course, has his own thoughts about this. Now, I have some quotes here. One was from October 2015. Now, he says, quote, "It's almost been a Camp of the Saints type invasion into the central and then Western and Northern Europe." In 2016, he said, quote, "The whole thing in Europe is all about immigration. It's a global issue today, this kind of global Camp of the Saints." He also says, "It's not a migration," he said later on in January. "It's really an invasion. I call it the Camp of the Saints." In 2016, April 2016, he said, "When we first started talking about this a year ago, we called it the Camp of the Saints. I mean, this is the Camp of the Saints, isn't it?" Well, what is he talking about? As you can see, quote after quote, he's referencing Camp of the Saints, Camp of the Saints, Camp of the Saints. What the hell is Camp of the Saints? Well, I have some information on that. Now, apparently, it is a 1970s obscure French novel. Now, what it does, and how it applies to Bannon, is that it depicts white civilization being overrun by migrants, immigrants. Now, the Huffington Post explains, "The plot of the Camp of the Saints follows a poor Indian demagogue," and you'll appreciate the name, right? Who basically leads an armada of 800,000 impoverished Indians that are sailing on a ship to France. Now, of course, Indian, they use Indian, but it really is kind of a representation of all brown people. So now, in this book, the European politicians, bureaucrats, religious leaders, including, ironically enough, very interestingly enough, a liberal pope from Latin America, can anybody say Pope Francis, debate whether or not to let the ships land and accept these refugees, these poor refugees from other countries. Now, what the book says and considers the right thing is not accepting them, but actually murdering them. That's the right thing to do according to the book. Oh, that's amazing. Now, the book said that the reason for that is that the landing will be a signal for all non-white people to rise up everywhere with the ultimate goal of overthrowing white civilization. So this book that Bannon references, literally he thinks is applicable to the refugee crisis, is actually just a way for brown people to go and overthrow white civilization. Now that is kind of mental and actually pretty racist. All right. Now, if that's not enough, in the book, Calguez, who is the protagonist in the story, he is the hero of this story, basically is fighting with the migrants, right? He is literally taking up arms to fight violently against these migrants that are coming into this country. Also, he's fighting against their culturally, quote, cuckolded white supporters. Now, if you've wondered why the word cuck has suddenly become so popular among the far right, well, that's your answer. It's in this book. Now, just before murdering a radical hippie, Calguez compares his own actions to past heroic defenses of European Christendom. So that's your hero. This guy who's murdering hippies and immigrants. Well, if that guy's your hero, well, then who's your villain? Their villain is a poor Indian demagogue called Turd Eater. Because in the book, he literally eats shit. Wow. Now, listen to how they describe the other migrants that are on the ship. "Scraggy branches, brown and black, all bare, those fleshless Gandhi arms, Poor brown children are spoiled fruit, starting to rot, all wormy inside, or turned so you can't see the mold. That's how he describes the author of this book, these migrants, these refugees from India. Oh, not only that, but the people on board the ship are also described as sexual deviants. Get this. The conditions on the ship were that of essentially nonstop orgies. Quote, everywhere, rivers of sperm streaming over bodies, oozing between breasts and buttocks and thighs and lips and fingers. Wow. So that's the description of the migrants. That's what they think of the migrants on this ship. Now here's more, right? Because obviously what I told you should be enough to convince you of the inherent white supremacy in this book. Now the view here that is basically that white Christianity, the white Christian world, Western civilization, is essentially on the brink of destruction. All because these black and brown people, well, it's because they're more sexual, they're more fertile, they're more numerous, they outnumber us, man. And all while the West has lost and they quote, necessary belief in their own cultural and racial superiority. And by the way, in the book, that hippie that Calgaz kills, he explains to him how the youth went so wrong. Quote, that scorn of a people for other races, the knowledge that one's own is best, the triumphant joy at feeling oneself to be part of humanity's finest. None of that had ever filled these youngsters' addled brains. So look at the message here. If you don't believe that your race, as a white person, this only applies to white people because they're superior, right? If you don't believe that, then your brain has been addled. And not only that, but you deserve death because you have been culturally cuckolded. This is the book that Steve Bannon goes back to over and over and over again to describe what he thinks is happening with immigration. And I've had people tell me, this is amazing. Bannon's not racist. He's not a white supremacist at all. How dare you besmirch his good name? How dare you? You know he was once in the military? Yeah, he also worked at Goldman Sachs. It doesn't make him a good person. In fact, Goldman Sachs counts against him. And besides, this isn't me calling him a racist or a white supremacist. This is him basically saying, I like this racist book that says white people are fantastic and brown people are so moldy and filled with worms inside, and they get to a point of where you can't even tell that they've turned. And that's how bad and moldy and disgusting these people are. That's not me saying it. That's Bannon saying, I like this piece of literature. And what we're going through right now is what's happened in that book. And you know what we got to do? We got to defend ourselves. We got to kill the migrants, the immigrants. We got to block them from coming in here. If you don't believe me, there's more. Bannon has also expressed recently admiration for a reactionary French philosopher named Charles Maurras. According to French media reports confirmed by Politico, Maurras, like Bannon, is a Catholic nationalist, and he argued in the early 1900s that the Enlightenment had elevated the individual over the nation. And basically, Bannon has also said, according to close contacts, that he would like to see the Enlightenment end. Gone. Yeah, I can't wait for the Enlightenment to end. Now, what's interesting about this is that this ties into another thing Bannon believes. Bannon has described himself as a cultural Leninist. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it's different from cultural Marxist. Okay, it sort of is this economic sort of populism, and that would explain why he has some of these economic populist ideas that he spread to Donald Trump that actually were sort of popular. But here's the thing about Maurras. He was also a literal Nazi. According to Mother Jones, Maurras spent years writing anti-Semitic articles referring to the French government known as the Third Republic as, quote, the Jew state, the Masonic state, the immigrant state. In 1936, Maurras served 8 months in prison for inciting the attempted assassination of a Jewish politician named Leon Blum and other French officials. Basically, he had penned numerous articles calling for Blum to be lynched, shot in the back, and to have his throat slit. Maurras's newspaper also supported the Nazis, the Nazi regime in France, and named, hunted down enemies, called for hostages, resistance, and Jews to be shot, and Gaullists as well. Now, in his political column during the war, Maurras wrote that if the death penalty is not sufficient to put a stop to the Gaullists, members of their families should be seized as hostages and executed. Well, that sounds a bit like a Donald Trump position. Oh, the terrorists, we should go after their families. Remember, during the campaign, we're going to go after their families. Let's go after this, bomb their families. That was a position that he held in order to fight ISIS. And now and of course, you saw it all the way back in the day during World War II. This is what they wanted to do to the Jews. So, look, Maurras was eventually sentenced to life in prison for supporting Nazism. He was a literal Nazi. This is a guy that Steve Bannon has admiration for. Bannon, as you know, he is one of the top people in the White House. He is a white supremacist. There is no doubt in my mind that he is a white supremacist. And now this is a guy who looks up to someone who was a literal Nazi. The more you know about Steve Bannon, the worse he gets. And I didn't think that was possible. And unfortunately, this is a guy who has the ear of the most powerful man in America, the President of the United States. God help us all. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.